Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 32 of Opening Basics. In this video I'm going to start to take a look at the Dutch defense. So the Dutch defense is the move f5, played after white starts out with d4, so it's a response to d4. It has some sort of philosophical similarity to the Sicilian defense. You know, in the Sicilian defense, c5 is played in response to e4. Basically, black is not trying to stake an equal claim to the center, but kind of approaching it from the side. Compared to the Sicilian, black is taking a bit more of a risk because he's pushing that pawn forward on the king side and opening up this diagonal towards his king and weakening the king side pawn structure somewhat. But in exchange for that, he gets a nice attacking opening with some winning chances. So this can be a good opening for you if you don't mind taking some risks in order to get winning chances with black. It also tends to lead to closed positions, so you have to be up for a closed maneuvering type of game. But if that's what you like, it's definitely a good choice for you. In terms of its theoretical reputation, it's the main line these days it's played at the top level is the Leningrad Dutch, and even that is not all that popular. So, but Hikaru Nakamura has played it, and will still play it, I guess, on occasion. I think the thinking at the top levels is that they don't take so much risk with the black pieces these days. They mostly play pretty solidly with black and are content to settle for a draw if that's all they can go, rather than all they can get, rather than try and go for more and then risk losing. But I think at the club level, all of these lines are quite playable, and I see in my own experience, I play D4, and I see the Stonewall Dutch fairly often, so I think you will run into it, and I think it's quite playable. Just to talk about the videos for a second. In this video, I'm going to do kind of an overview of the Dutch defense, talk about the different lines briefly, just to distinguish between them, and then talk about some interesting sidelines, including the Staunton Gambit. And then in subsequent videos, I'll go into more detail about the main lines, the classical Stonewall and Leningrad Dutch systems. But let's show what these systems are that I've been talking about. So first of all, I guess the first one we'll show is the Leningrad Dutch. So I continue with g3. This is arguably the main line. Black continues with knight f6, bishop g2, g6, knight f3, bishop to g7, castles. Let's see, you can castle here. Let's put the pawn move in first. c4, castles. This would castles, and then it's black's turn to move. So this is the setup I wanted to get to, and I wanted to do it this way because it's not so much about the specific move order in the Dutch. So this system that white has could have been reached by a number of different move orders. g3 is the most common first move, and that's what I played here. But you can also start with c4, and you can also start with knight f3. So it's this whole constellation of g3, knight f3, c4 that is a typical setup that white has against the Dutch, and that's what we will be taking a look at when we look at all the main lines. That's what the black player mostly faces. And now if we look at the Leningrad Dutch here, we see these pawns on light squares, but the pawns on the queen side have not been committed. And in fact, it's often an idea. Well, then the next move, the most common move here, is to play d6, opening up the light squares for this bishop to come out, and putting these pawns on dark squares. And then the follow-up can be queen here, knight here. The problem with this kind of setup is white often has the move d5 to kind of clamp down on black center here. But it's similar to the French defense. Black can kind of counterattack with e6 and try and undermine white center. So you have to be prepared to fight back as black, and white does get a little more space in the center. So this is a comfortable setup for white against many of the opening systems. So anyway, this is system one for black, is the Leningrad Dutch, and that's the early castling, the fianchetto of the king side bishop, and this pawn structure, which is similar to a fianchetto, but with the f-pawn advanced in front of the knight. setting up this line of pawns here. Leningrad Dutch. Okay, so let's back up. And the next one I wanted to show was the classical Dutch. So d4, f5, g3. Once again, I'm just going to go with the same setup for white as I showed in the previous one. So knight to f6, bishop g2, and now instead of going with g6, the second choice here is e6, and this is going to be the classical Dutch with the pawns in this configuration after, excuse me, that was not the move, after c4 here. Bishop to e7 can be played, and knight to f3, and now castles, and once again we've got to this same setup where white has these pawns here, knight and the bishop fianchettoed, and black has a similar setup but with these pawns on light squares. And in this position there's two ways to continue. There's more than that. There are lines involving d6 and lines involving d5, and d5 leads into the Stonewall, but at this point here we can call it a classical Dutch because of this setup. And if we go forward into the Stonewall, say d5, b3 is a common response, c6, this is a complete Stonewall setup like this. And the pawns being on light squares gives a unique character to the Stonewall Dutch, which is quite different actually than the Leningrad Dutch. It makes this bishop a very bad piece, at least at the moment. But remember what I said about it being a closed position. There's actually time for black in many of these lines to maneuver this bishop into a more active role, doing some kind of zigzag like this. So it's not so hopeless for the pieces. And even though the main line here goes bishop a3, trying to exchange off this dark squared bishop, which looks like the good bishop in this position, it's still a position that's interesting for white to play, even for black to play, even after he loses that dark squared bishop, because he's got the knights, it's a closed position, and the game is going to go on for a long time. And of course there's always opportunities to break out and push those pawns forward as well. So those are the three setups. And just go back to the opening moves. So and back up even further. So d4, f5. So the pawns in this line and the king side castling with the fianchettoed bishop, that's the Leningrad Dutch, and the most popular at the top level these days. The pawns on this diagonal with the bishop on e7, also with kingside castling, that's the classical Dutch. And then if there's even more pawns on light squares, then you get into the Stonewall. Now the most popular way of getting into the Stonewall, let's show the Stonewall setup. g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6, still going like you're going for the classical, c4, and then here the main move for the Stonewall is actually c6, throwing in this move right away. So that after knight f3, now d5. And the idea is that the development of this bishop is being delayed. Black castles, and this bishop can go to d6 instead of going to e7. And this is the most popular way of getting into the Stonewall setup currently. So that's, once again, we have the pawns all on light squares. And black will castle. Let's see, let's go ahead and put that in here. Oh, actually, queen e7 is a move here. That's to prevent the bishop from coming to a3 and trading off the dark squared bishop. Bishop b2, and now black can castle. We get this kind of setup. So this is the current way that the Stonewall is played, and it's an interesting system to fight against. Notice that this f-pawn always gives black some attacking ideas involving pushing this pawn forward and creating pawn weaknesses around white's camp. In contrast, white can go for trying to dominate the center, placing a knight here. This knight will often be developed to d7 here to support the other knight, and we get this kind of configuration and keeping this bishop open. So trying to control these dark squares here with the bishop from b2. So those are your three setups, the three classical setups with the Dutch, where white, let's back up a few moves. In all cases with white, I was always going for this same setup with the pawns on c4 and d4, knight on f3, and pawn on g3. And so your three setups are the Stonewall, the classical, and the Leningrad. Now let's so that completes the overview, and I'm going to give more detail about the Stonewall and the classical in the next video, and then the Leningrad probably in the third video in this series. And I wanted to finish off this video looking at some non-standard responses by white to the Dutch defense. So let's take a look at this. After d4, f5, any of the moves g3, knight f3, or c4 would lead to similar lines that we've seen already. But there's some oddball lines here. Let's show one of the rarest one. This move here. Pawn to g4 right away. Just trying to, I guess this is similar to the wing gambit against the Sicilian. And similar to that gambit, it's not especially good. This is not quite a sound gambit. Black with good play can get some kind of slight edge here, although it's not a totally ridiculous gambit. White has some compensation, just probably not enough for the pawn. So black takes right away, and white can ignore it for a while, maybe develop the bishop to f4 first, but at some point he's got to do something about that pawn because it's controlling these squares where this knight wants to go. So h3 is usually how it's played. And then black can just continue with d5. The reason why this gambit is not so threatening is that the weakness of the Dutch defense is the f-pawn has come forward. So you really want to bring the queen out here to this diagonal and give the check to the king. That's where a lot of your counterplay with white is going to come against the Dutch, a lot of your attacking ideas. And yet this pawn that was sacked here on g4, it can just sit here for a while and it will clog up that diagonal. So white can take the pawn right away or continue to developing, but I think it makes most sense to grab. And then black doesn't have to take back, but black can keep developing. And then white can play on. White needs to bring a piece out, maybe bishop here. And then finally grabbing the pawn. Black will be a pawn up. But, white does have compensation for the pawn. It's maybe a little bit awkward that the king side remains a bit exposed over here, and it'll be easy for white to maybe get some attacks going on the open G and H files. So maybe it's a little bit awkward there. But, black could also consider castling queen side as well. In any case, it just seems that white does not have enough compensation for the pawn. Although I have to say that when I started playing the Dutch defense with black, I wanted to get some blitz games and get some experience with the black position, try and understand a little bit more about it. And one of the first games I played, my opponent played that g4 move against me. And I went ahead and took, and I got a decent game out of it, but it really caught me by surprise. So it is occasionally played, even though it's not especially good. Let's see, a much more interesting way to play against it, and one that's particularly appropriate if you know your opponent, if you have the white pieces and you know your opponent likes to play the Leningrad Dutch with the kingside development, you can play this line with knight to c3 and bishop to g5. And once again, I think those moves can be played pretty much in either order. Let's start with bishop g5. And then normally the knight just continues to develop, or say g6, say he's going for that Leningrad setup, knight to c3. So these two moves go together, knight c3 and bishop g5. Now the knight comes out, and what's funny here is that you have the very strong move h5. And, black can try various things here, but this turns out to be a really serious threat here. Say, just continuing. You just push on with h5. And if black grabs that pawn, you sack the exchange here. And you have a couple of ideas. One is to push the e-pawn forward so that the queen can grab on h5. But you also have knight d5 piling up on this on the e-pawn, which is not so easy to defend. And well, if the bishop defends, you get this kind of pawn structure, which is a nightmare. And after e3, the queen is going to round up. This is actually a line. Castle's here, and the queen goes here. And, do you really want to play this kind of position with black? Even though black is up the exchange, white's attack is really just too strong. So that is something to watch out for, this knight c3, bishop g5 idea with white. And it's an interesting way to play, particularly if you know that your opponent likes to go for the Leningrad Dutch. And it can go in the other order too. Let's see. Suppose the knight comes out first, and black is going for, you can go knight f6 here, bishop here, pawn here, bishop here, and we just got into the same position by a different move order. And that's the idea here. White just pushes this pawn forward and sacrifices it, and when this knight is gone, then knight to d5 is a very strong move. So if you're black and you're playing the Dutch, and you see this unusual move, either knight c3 or bishop g5, you might want to think twice about continuing with the Stonewall. You can play knight f6 as kind of a waiting move here. And then if he continues with bishop g5, which is the main move here, then the best way to combat this is actually to switch lines and to go to the Stonewall. So you go to d5 and, e3. White can continue developing, or g3, set up some kind of normal system. He can take. This is a line he can take. And he takes f6 is not so bad. You're going to get some open lines here, and probably castle kingside and get some quick pressure on the e-file. So that's not too bad. And if white just continues with normal development, you go with e6 and get that whole Stonewall going, bishop e7. In this case, the old Stonewall with the bishop on e7 rather than d6 is better, because you want to fight against the pin. And this setup is okay for black. So if you can get into the Stonewall setup from that bishop g5 maneuver, if you learn how to play the Stonewall with bishop e7, then this should be a pretty comfortable position for black. So that's the way to play it. It's still, actually, I should say, I don't want to give the impression that that's a bad way to play for white. It's still one of those lines that leaves white with an opening edge. So definitely an interesting way for white to play, particularly if he wants to keep his opponent from playing the Leningrad Dutch, and he wants to go for that exchange sacrifice line that's pretty interesting there. And then finally, so I would say that's maybe the number two in terms of solidity. The most solid way to play is the way for white is the way I showed first with g3 and knight f3, c4, d4, and then the second most solid way for white to play is with this knight c3, bishop g5 setup, because it does kind of work against all the different Dutch systems, and black can go for the Stonewall against it. And then the third most interesting way for white to play here is the Staunton Gambit. And now this was thought to be quite strong at one time. Currently it's a little bit out of favor, but I think white still gets some kind of edge out of this gambit. So unlike the spike or the wing gambit, this gambit is pretty solid. Black can take this pawn. I've also played, this is a gambit I play myself as white, although I've never played it over the board, just in blitz games, but I seem to get decent positions out of it. And I just like the classical setup with white in an over-the-board slow game. I don't mind a slow maneuvering game, but this is a way, if you're white, you want to get your opponent out of that idea of a slow maneuvering game. You want to kind of open things up quickly and still have a decent, interesting position. You can just throw in that e4 move. Okay, so the idea here is to develop quickly, bring pressure on that pawn, maybe just win it right back if he doesn't defend. And so black defends with the knight. That's pretty typical. And to play in gambit style, you can play the immediate f3. And this is not bad. If black takes, you take back, and you have quite an open position here. You're just down a pawn, so this is a pure gambit. And but your bishops both have open lines. Your knights are developed. You're going to castle quickly and have pressure on that open f file. And so and black is just way behind in development. So you have decent compensation here. Usually black, the better move actually is not to take the pawn. I can develop with knight to c6, or try and hold on to the pawn with d5. After knight c6, you can just take the pawn back, and you've got a big center, so that's nothing to really worry about. And then after d5, you take here, and then he takes back, and you're down a pawn, but the extra pawn that black has is this funny doubled e-pawn, and so this is a pretty decent position too. You develop with bishop g5, and well, we'll show this in just a second here. So that's the immediate f3. But let's show the main line of the Staunton Gambit. So let's go back to the beginning, just so we can get the move order fixed in our heads. It's d4, f5, the Dutch defense, e4, the Staunton Gambit. Black takes, that's the main response and the best move. Now knight c3 attacking, knight f6 defending, and then not committing to the gambit right away, but playing bishop to g5 is the main move. And this sets a little trap, and I've won some games with this trap, so it's useful to know. Black might consider playing the natural move d5 here, and that's a mistake. So if black plays d5, what you can do is you can grab the knight, and then this check, taking advantage of that open diagonal towards the king. You get to pick up the center pawn here. So g6 blocking is the only move here, and then queen takes. And now, no matter what black does in this position, white is going to be better. If black just trades, maybe the simplest continuation, the knight comes here, and it's got a double threat. It's threatening c7, and it's threatening f6, and of course c7 is a fork, so king to d8 pretty much has to be played. So black has lost his castling privileges, and white's going to be equal in material, or maybe even up in material. That's an extra pawn. So anyway, white is winning in that line. I mean, not by a huge margin, but that's maybe enough just to score a win there. And then, well, the other way to play is like this, and that's maybe a little bit better. Just developing this bishop, preventing white from castling quickly, because queenside castling is now illegal, but giving up a pawn. So turning it into a counter sack, and then king to f7. So the king hopes to find shelter on the king side by sort of castling by hand. And of course, white has to be careful. These pieces are lined up on the e file, but it can be saved. You throw in this check, king here, and then knight here to block the e file. So if a rook comes here, the queen doesn't get skewered to the king. So and you see that white, in addition to being a pawn up, has pretty good development and can castle to the king side. So also a winning position for white. So that's, of course, it's just a mistake to play d5. That's the answer there. So there's better ways to play. So let's go back once more and go through the main line all the way. So the we have d4, f5, e4, the Staunton Gambit. Takes, knight c3, attacking the pawn, knight f6 defending, bishop g5, pressuring that knight and setting up that little trick. And then the main move here is c6, preparing to play d5. So c6, defending d5 before playing it. You can also try knight c6. So knight c6 is something to look at. And white can push on with d5, try and kick the knight around. And knight to e5 is the main move there, and then the queen develops with tempo. So white plays on a pawn down, and just plays for activity, and pretty interesting position. But the main line continues with c6, trying to build up that center. And now you could grab the knight and get the pawn back, but this is not so good. I just want to show this. If you grab here, take the pawn, you've equalized in material, but black is going to play d5, and actually black ends up with a better position after this. You've got to move that knight again, and black's king is relatively secure. There's just this slight weakness over here, but there's no big lead in development, nothing that white can do to take advantage of it. And so, and black has the bishop pair, so it's actually a good position for black. So the way to play this, rather than taking off that knight, is to go into that gambit line again. So f3, and now e takes is the main move. Queen a5 has been tried to, let's take a look at queen a5. Queen a5 here, just trying to force this exchange. And then white will get the pawn back that way. So that looks like an okay position for white. And then the other more challenging way to play it is e takes f3, knight takes f3. And once again, we have that a kind of position where white has, he's turned it into a true gambit, but he has some compensation for the pawn in terms of open lines for his bishop, active pieces. And so this is a position that is technically about equal, and I think this is why you don't see the Staunton Gambit played so much. But it's pretty interesting for white. The gambit compensation is pretty real from this position. So anyway, that's it for this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the classical and the Stonewall Dutch, and then in the third video in this series, I'm going to talk about the Leningrad Dutch, the modern main line of the Dutch defense. Okay, stay tuned. I will see you later. Bye.